How Georgina Island First Nation took back control of their lands and resources. The Chippewas of Georgina Island, originally named Wasiagmuk, meaning place of shining waters, were renamed the Chippewas of Georgina Island by the Canadian federal government. Under the Indian Act, the Chippewas of Georgina Island did not have control over their own reserved territory. In 2001, they became one of the first communities in Canada to regain control of the lands, leases on the lands, and resources on the lands through the Framework Agreement on First Nation Land Management. The First Nations Land Management Act, FNLMA for short, only applies to reserve lands, not all traditional territory of a nation. The nation must be economically stable enough to engage in a process of applying for a land code and must have strong leadership to maintain the land and resources without help from the government. The Indian Act plays a huge role in the treatment of Indigenous peoples and ongoing assimilationist policies. Law has been used to control and dominate Aboriginal communities for decades. It can also be used, however, to reverse the effects of colonialism, and the success of Georgina Island is a great example of this. In this case, the residents of Georgina Island have regained control over their own economy, ecosystems, and land management. The federal government has made sure, thanks to the Band Council of the island, to consult with the residents of the land about their legal traditions and practices since the FNLMA was signed. In 2012, they received compensation of $307 million from the federal government, along with other Chippewa nations, for the wrongful taking of the Coldwater Narrows Reserve in 1836 between Lake Simcoe, where Georgina Island is located, and Lake Huron. The Chippewas of Georgina Island later received a water treatment plant in 2017 after being on a boil water advisory for 2 years and consulted on a sub-watershed proposal to oppose a sewage treatment plant in Lake Simcoe in 2017, as they are the first keepers of the lake and thus have seen firsthand the ecological damage the lake has faced over the years. The project's central tenet was to keep their cultural practices in mind, which is key to proper reconciliation attempts. Pre-contact, Aboriginals had the upper hand, having been in what is now known as Canada for longer. Although after contact and cooperation, European settlers realized they needed more land, and in stage 3 of their nation-to-nation relationship, they forced the displacement, dispossession, and disruption, as well as cultural assimilation, of Indigenous peoples throughout the country. In the 19th century, the Department of Upper Canada separated Indians from white settlements. In Georgina, they were forced onto Snake, Fox, and Georgina Islands to farm the lands. Under the veil of terra nullius, Aboriginal sovereignty and the right to occupancy are ignored. The doctrine of discovery claims that Canada was discovered by European settlers and takes away any right to self-government of Georgina Island. The 1867 Constitution gave the federal government jurisdiction over lands reserved for Indians, and the Indian Act gave the federal government control over Indigenous communities. The White Paper in 1969 asserted that Aboriginal land claims were too difficult to define and that it is impossible to recognize them, essentially destroying the nation-to-nation relationship altogether. An Indian agent was then put in place to oversee the affairs of the First Nations on the island and to ensure assimilation continued. In the past, law has been used to control, dominate, and eliminate the growth of Aboriginal communities, including the Chippewas of Georgina Island. Their land was stolen and leased out to cottagers, with all of the revenue going to the federal government. In the 1800s, Methodist church camps and schools arrived on the island to convert Indigenous peoples to Christianity. They forbid speaking the mother tongue, their traditional ceremonies of smudging circles, and prayers and medicines were banned. But they continued to be used in secrecy. However, an Indian agent who looked over the reserve would severely punish them if they were caught. Because of assimilationist policies like these, only 8 elders are believed to speak Anishinaabemowin, though the school on the island is teaching the native language and traditions today. The failure to recognize assimilation as a cultural genocide under the UN hinders recognition and the reconciliation process, and taking a frozen rights approach to Aboriginal rights does not recognize the fluidity and changes in distinct cultures that have undergone such traumas and oppression. In 1973, Frank Calder argued in BC court on behalf of the Niska Nation to claim their traditional territory lands, and won in the Supreme Court. This set a precedent for many other nations to attempt to claim their traditional lands, including Georgina Island, who later did so through a newer legal channel which will be discussed. Today, this law is being used to reverse the effects of colonialism and give nations back their reserved territory. There are many legal and constitutional issues that this community has faced over the course of history and in the process of regaining its land. Section 91 of the 1867 Constitution granted the federal government jurisdiction over Indians and lands reserved for Indians, including Georgina Island. Later, in 1982, Trudeau decided to repatriate the Constitution to include the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, as well as Section 35, which protects the rights of Aboriginal peoples. Section 35 protects their claims to land rights, however, with a high standard of justification. This has been denied in the past, and when proven, still takes years to do so. Claiming Aboriginal rights requires existing treaty rights to be traceable to the pre-contact period, and the same goes for territorial land claims. This is one of the reasons why it is so difficult to regain ownership of lands taken away. In 1991, the federal government adopted the inherent right policy to self-government, but it has not been adopted into a constitutional framework, therefore it is not protected under Section 35. For a long time, Georgina Island was managed by the federal government and Indian agents, who disregarded their complaints about cottagers' treatment of the land and water, as well as their legal traditions. Canada also opposed the UN's Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, which stated that they have rights to their lands and compensation for lands taken away. They have since adopted the declaration, but not made it legally binding. The issue of land recognition of Georgina Island is neither one of Aboriginal rights nor treaty rights, which makes it rather complicated. It is not an Aboriginal rights issue because an Aboriginal right must be a practice, tradition, or custom that was established pre-contact, and self-government and ownership of land are not practices, customs, or traditions that fall under this category. It is not a treaty rights issue because, again, under Section 35 of the Constitution, treaty rights have to be pre-existing. Recently, the Supreme Court ruled that lawmakers do not have a duty to consult with Indigenous peoples before introducing legislation in Parliament that may affect Aboriginal and treaty rights, continuing to be a colonial oppressor. The honor of the Crown and the fiduciary relationship are two core principles which should make the process more accessible, if they are respected. First Nations have deep, powerful ancestral roots in their traditional lands. Through the FNLMA, reserve lands are distinct in that only First Nations on reserves can apply for a land code to be ratified. There are many challenges to economic development on First Nations reserves, however, that non-Indigenous communities or Indigenous communities off reserve do not face. The fact that this community is on an island makes the location inaccessible to many, and businesses on the island have less of a chance for success than businesses on the mainland. The location, the lack of infrastructure, and the complications of regulating businesses on reserve all pose great barriers to their success. Under the FNLMA, the land title is still vested in the Crown, which means it does not amount to ownership, but it removes them from the shadow of the Indian Act. The land code gives them a degree of autonomy as well, though specific provisions must be agreed upon between the community and the federal government. Today they are doing well with strong leadership. They have a chief, Donna Big Canoe, and 4 band council members, and their goal is to move towards full self-governance. Traditionally, many Indigenous communities talk about the canoe metaphor, where a canoe has been tipped, lost its possessions, regained them, but they are forever changed. Something new must be created to move forward, and for this reason, as well as in order to prove to the federal government that they can sustain themselves, the Island View Business Center has been created with offices, a restaurant, a law practice, and other opportunities for small businesses. They have also gotten a water treatment plant for Lake Simcoe, as previously mentioned. They have been and continue to be a community that others look to as an example of success, as many communities in Canada are still developing land codes and going through the lengthy process of the FNLMA. Overall, law has obviously been a negative force on Aboriginal peoples and has stripped them of their rights to their own land and any resources from that land, while simultaneously oppressing them on a systemic level and maintaining barriers to social, economic, political, and health prosperity. In this case, the FNLMA is a very small way to reverse the effects of the Indian Act regarding land rights, but it in no way reverses the trauma caused by the bill and other oppressive laws. The very principle, though, of having to prove your worth and ability to govern your own lands is in and of itself a systemic issue, but currently is the best solution the federal government has proposed to move forward towards reconciliation in terms of land management. We still have a long way to go. Thank you very much.